Hello, I'm Ryan Cook, and this is Civic Tech Chat, a podcast about the civic technology movement. We seek to harness the power technology has to improve the delivery of public services to people everywhere.
Welcome back for another episode of Civic Tech Chat. If you've liked our content so far, head on over to your podcast app and give us a 5-star review. Doing so helps us reach a broader audience and helps motivate me to continue making these episodes. This week, we're joined by David Holmes, Engineering Director with the United States Digital Service. We'll get to learn and lean on his experience as we talk about a few topics, including the idea of technology accessibility, partners and the transition of business rules into code, as well as mentoring and developing engineers on engineering teams. I know that I enjoyed this conversation, and hopefully you will too. So let's go ahead and hop right into it. David, thank you so much for coming on to Civic Tech Chat. Can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Thanks, Ryan, for having me. Really excited to be on this podcast. So my name is David Holmes. I'm the Director of Engineering at US Digital Service. And kind of a little bit of detail, just in case some folks don't know what US Digital Service is we're basically a startup in the White House that's tasked with handling, really tough technical problems and using design and technology to deliver better government services to the people. Like for instance, right, it doesn't make sense I can order McDonald's from an app on my phone and it just shows up, right? And just a magical, easy to use app. But if a veteran wants healthcare, they have to go through this entire complex process. So we work on those tough problems that we try to make something that shouldn't be that hard and just make it easier so that way people can use them in a better way. As Director of Engineering, I pretty much oversee the entire engineering community. And my main focus there is just making sure that all the engineers are happy, working with agency leads that we have to ensure that all the projects we have is fully staffed up. I'm also on the hiring committee that reviews all the interviews and transcripts and make a determination if someone should come on board or not. I also do some biz dev work, in between it, as we're starting new agencies and the projects. I'll talk to some of the folks there at those agencies before we start the project.
It sounds like you've got quite a bit of different hats there you have to wear. I imagine you're a pretty busy person over there with the USDS role.
Yeah, a little busy. I'm always down to have conversations like this.
Awesome. Speaking of your USDS presence, you have a page on there that talks a bit about you and perhaps why you joined USDS. And in that page, you cite an article and a Hacker News post that links to it from 2015 as a point of inspiration for joining the agency. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I was on Hacker News, this one day as I usually am, and I see this article. I think the headline was something like Obama's self-startup in the White House, and I was like, at the time I was definitely working at a bunch of different startups, and I loved working in the startup culture. And I was like, one in the federal government, yes, I'm on board. And I clicked the article. I didn't even read the comment. I just clicked the article, and I got halfway through the article, and I was just like, I got to apply right now. And I just went and just sent my resume in. In a few months, I was here at USDS, just off that Fast Company article and the Hacker News post.
On that same page, you also mentioned that learning the plethora of acronyms used in government was a challenge as you got started, which is certainly understandable. There are quite a few of those that float around. Over time, has that gotten easier? And do you have a favorite acronym among them?
It has definitely gotten a lot easier, not just rattle them off in conversation, so I apologize if I use some here. I don't know if I have a favorite among them, but I definitely have a favorite government website URL. And so the register to register a .gov web address is .gov.gov. And that's just my favorite URL. I just picture being in that room making a decision. What should we name this? And someone was just just .gov. And it's yes, we know it's a .gov, but what should we name this? No, I mean .gov.gov. If you go to .gov.gov, that is the .gov register for all the government websites and URLs. So this is my favorite government website URL. And I think my favorite URL almost anywhere.
Oh, I think it would be amazing to have been a fly on the wall for that meeting. I imagine that turned into very much like a who's on first kind of situation.
Yeah, I imagine. I wish I could just go back and just be in that room.
And as you mentioned, you're currently a director of engineering. I imagine there was some steps before that in your career. How would you describe that path as you've ventured upward toward now leading a practice?
So back when I came to USDS in 2016, I started working on the Social Security Administration project called Disability Claims Processing System, and that was basically how do we make the disability claims processing system a little bit better. Then I moved on to Department of Education, where we help students get out of debt and default, because tons of people are in student loan debt. And then I moved on to Small Business Administration, where we help disadvantaged businesses apply to get to the 8A certification a little bit easier. Some people was paying up to $30,000 to get into this program, which is free because it was so complicated. So we just made that a little bit easier. Now it's 100% digital, and you can do everything just straight online. And then I went to FEMA, where we help with the grants ministry modernization, where they're trying to take 10 different grant systems down into one. And as you can imagine, there's 10 different systems. You don't even know which one to actually go to. So we're trying to just, how do we, consolidate that down into one? And I became director of engineering here at USDS. So it's been an interesting journey and a lot of impact. So how I would describe that path is just, interesting and impactful, right? Across the breadth of, in 3 years, I was able to have so much impact across many different agencies.
As an engineer, kind of trying to make that impact, as you mentioned, I imagine that there's a plethora of different tools and technologies that you've used along the way. In your experience so far, do you have a favorite or a go-to programming language or tool set? And if so, why is that your choice?
So my go-to programming language is Python. And the reason why it's my choice is, so like on MacBooks and Linux, it comes installed by default. And just a Python standard library, you could just do so much just with the standard library. And that's just usually my go-to, especially if I just want to write like a simple script or something like that. I just default, just jump straight into Python. And my go-to tool, I would probably say for my editor, I use Sublime. I just love it. It just opens fast. It can open, large files. And I know there's like VS Code and Atom and all those new things coming out, but just Sublime just gets me. I even pay for it because I'm probably because like it's just so great.
I can definitely understand both those choices. I myself rather enjoy both Sublime and Python, so I'm right there with you on those opinions. All right, I'd like to go ahead and have us switch gears here a little bit. And we're going to end up talking through a couple of different topics, including some stuff about accessibility, some stuff about partners and the idea of like turning business rules into code, and then a little bit about mentoring and the development of engineers. To start that, though, I'd like to hop into the accessibility portion of our conversation. And to start that off, I think there's an assumption out there that public sector projects have to work a little harder at accessibility than those in the private sector. I suppose there's the assumption that the public side can't hand wave some of that away via audience targeting, like maybe the private sector can. Is that something in your experience that seems to be true? Whether it is or isn't, like what kind of impact does that have on your work?
Yep. So it's definitely true. So by law, we have to do something that's called 508 compliance. And what that is just a law that requires federal governments to be safe and accessible for people with disabilities. And like a couple of months ago, I was actually just doing some fact checking. 20% of Americans have some type of disability. And a lot of the work that we do impacts some of the most vulnerable populations. We need to make sure that the work that we are outputting actually is usable by, every American citizen. And we want to make sure that we can help those folks as well. So the impact that it has on our work is nothing goes by without 508 compliance testing. And I think that's a good thing.
That makes a lot of sense. And I've heard folks often describe work to like get that sort of compliance. I've heard them describe it in a way that makes it seem like it's a hard problem, and to put that in quotes. Is that something you've observed, and are there patterns that you try to follow to get to that end goal?
No, I don't think it's a hard problem at all. One of the things that, that some people feel like it's hard, it's like actually built into the web. So there's things like alternate text for images, and make sure that you keep, people who are visually impaired or blind or, colorblind in mind when you're picking design colors. And a large part of what we do is we talk to the users, right? And we say like, hey, how would you use this? So we actually go out and talk to the most vulnerable populations. So how would you actually use this application? And then we work with them to make sure that it's easily accessible for them as well. But I don't think it's a hard problem. And there are some things you could do to learn more about, usability testing for 508 compliance at section 508.gov, or you could use the US Web Design System. which is 508 compliant.
Oh, for folks that aren't familiar with that system, could you give us kind of like the high level of what the web design system is?
Yeah, it's pretty much like Bootstrap. So if listeners are familiar with like the Bootstrap CSS framework, it's pretty much like that. It just makes it a little bit easier to build websites and build your user interface. And we did one internally for our websites, and then we branched out and open source that with the help of like 18F and others, which is a US web design system that, a big part of that is making sure that accessibility is like up and forward and center.
And that US web design project, is that like an open source initiative? Is that something folks can, just like anybody out there, can use and contribute to?
Yep, and we have tons of people who already just uses it for their websites all across the federal government. And it's open. You can go to designsystem.digital.gov to go learn more about it. And a lot of our projects, from the work that we do at the VA, even down to NASA, uses it.
Oh wow, that's quite a wide berth of folks getting involved with it.
Yep.
I also, like, in thinking about accessibility, I also get the sense that having it in mind early on in a project seems to be a thing that's desirable. Whether it's reading the United Kingdom's service manual stating something like "think about accessibility from the start," or from the U.S. web design system that we've been talking about for a moment, which is quoted as saying accessibility is fundamental. With that in mind, like, do those intentions then shape how y'all at USDS put projects and teams together?
Yep. So on every project and team that we have, there's a designer there who is super focused on that, and we do a lot of user research, so we are able to see those problems up front too. And because we have designers on every single team who can make sure that everything's 508 compliant, it does shape how we make sure that how we put teams together. And again, a large part of this that we do is user research, right? Going on things, talking to users and seeing how we could best serve them.
And we've mentioned the idea of being 508 compliant a couple of times. Could you give the audience maybe a little bit of an idea of like what that means as far as 508 compliance? And is there anything on the private sector side that kind of compares to that?
One of the things that 508 compliant does is just ensures that we aren't, like you said earlier, just building it for a target audience, and that we are building it for everybody. And it's just a law that Congress set up, I believe, a couple of decades ago, just to make sure that all federal websites are accessible by everybody.
And if there was one piece of advice you could give somebody starting a project that has that intention of like, I want to make sure that this project does respect those sorts of standards as they're getting going, what advice would you give that person?
I'll definitely tell them to check out section 508.gov, and you can learn way more about how to make your website more accessible by people with disabilities. And by also, the other thing I would say is, for especially in the private industry or in other government agencies, talk to your users. You may not actually know that your users are having difficulty accessing your website. So just go out there and try and talk to as much of your users as possible.
Awesome. I'm sure that there's folks out there that'll appreciate those insights as they kind of figure out how their own work day to day is going to happen. I'd like to now go ahead and talk a little bit about the idea of partners and how business rules can become code. And to start that off, as you're starting a new project, let's say you're working with an agency, perhaps maybe even for the first time, there's probably a set of interactions that happen. Could you talk to us a little bit about what those are like getting started?
Yep. So as we start, part of our project selection criteria is making sure that we pick projects that does the greatest good for the most amount of people in need. And that's where we start our base at, right? So we get a lot of offers to help with stuff, but then it just doesn't fit kind of our project selection criteria. And how those initial interactions are like is once we go on the ground floor, one of the things that we need is air cover. So we'll probably talk to a deputy secretary or maybe undersecretary or CIO or somebody kind of at that top level of the organization hierarchy, and make sure we have that air cover, and then have a project like scoped out for us. We just don't want to be there because you want us there, right? Like have a particular project scoped out for us to do. And so that the initial interactions are, once we have that air cover, we do what is called a discovery sprint. And over the next 2 weeks, we'll just kind of talk to people on the ground and everybody within the organization to kind of learn more about this. Because we don't know what we don't know. So the best thing that we could do is just go talk to all the stakeholders and people involved in the project and just learn as much as we can. And then from there, we deliver a report and kind of go and figure out, like, is it something that we could do? Or sometimes it's just that person who's on the ground level, in the trenches doing the work, who has a great idea. And now we are able to just empower them and put them in contact with the deputy secretary and say, like, hey, you should listen to this person because they know exactly what they're talking about and what they're doing. And, part of the reason my air cover is so important and why we try to go at the top of the hierarchy in organization all the way to in between and everywhere in between is because, sometimes things go wrong, right? Sometimes we're on the ground floor and somebody's like, I can't give you access to that data. And we can go like, oh no, the CIO said like it's okay to give us access to that. So that's why that air cover is really, really important for us to have.
One thing I think I heard you mention the explanation was this idea that there's some criteria about whether or not the organization considers the work the sort that you'd like to engage with. Could you talk a little bit about the process behind that sort of determination a little bit?
Yeah, so all the leadership at USDS sort of gets together and we just talk about it, and we'll have like an initial conversation with the person who asks and say, okay, what is the problem that you're actually trying to solve? And then we'll just have a in-depth conversation about that problem they're trying to solve. And sometimes it may just be solved in that simple phone call, right? Sometimes it's just, you're trying to get the CI/CD pipeline set up, like, use Jenkins or something. And sometimes it gets more complicated. We actually have to go in and figure out what's the ground truth.
I would venture to guess along the way that there's probably a non-zero number of occasions where folks you have to work with or the organizations themselves can be a bit difficult, for lack of a better word, to collaborate with. Are there strategies that you found effective at addressing those kinds of situations?
Outside of, executive air cover, making sure that we have like that person who can like vouch for us and say like, no, these people are supposed to be here. I think one of the biggest things that we do is we just listen to the partners and stakeholders, and we try to make sure to understand where they're coming from and try to say like, hey, we're here to help you. We're not here to, tell you that you're doing it wrong and that we're better than you or anything like that. Like, no, we're just simply brought in to help and see how we can make this better. Because one thing I definitely learned working on multiple different agencies is everybody at each agency really, really does care. And sometimes it's just really hard for them to, share that out to the rest of like the organization. And one thing that we come with is like, because of this executive air cover, we can actually get those voices heard to a deputy secretary or undersecretary. So that's one way we found it to be in to work in those difficult to collaborate situations. And, just to tell them that we're temporary, right? We're not here to take your jobs, right? At USDS, we have tour of duty models. So we're here from as short as 3 months up to 4 years. And we're not trying to take your jobs, we're not trying to take over the project. We just simply want to help.
So you mentioned that a significant part of that is getting that. It sounds like kind of like buy-in from that higher level executive. What does that usually look like? What are those interactions tend to be like as you try to get that buy-in?
Usually just a couple of meetings, right? And just saying like, hey, yes, we do have, so like for instance, at some agencies there's no engineers, so they actually can't tell if like a vendor or contractor is telling them the truth or not. And one of the things we can go and say, hey, we have a ton of engineers and we can go and actually sit with you and tell you like, no, this is wrong and this is right, and just help you through that. So a lot of it looks like usually just comes through our administrative Matt Cuts, and then he'll like kind of, determine like if it's like something that we should do or not.
And I believe I also heard you describe the tour of duty model in there, as far as the basically the fact that you're there on a temporary basis. How does that impact like the way you both like shape that relationship and the project there, knowing that there's some sort of date where I would imagine there's a handoff of some sort that happens?
Yeah, so we try not to be load bearing because of this tour of duty model. And how it shapes relationships is because I think of this tour of duty model that we have, like it can give a sense of urgency to the project, right? So because we're not here for many years, right? Let's try and figure out how we can actually start the process of this, right? So one of the things that we've been successful in is moving folks and agencies from a waterfall model where they try to build requirements over 2 years and then they hand it to a vendor, which then takes another 2 years, to an agile method, right? Where we could kind of build this piece by piece. And as we talk to the users, we can, we can go in and switch gears as we get the user feedback to things that we found aren't working as well.
And I imagine that once the tour of duty, as we've been putting it, starts and you start to work with your partner on putting a solution together, that you can encounter some pretty complex requirements and business rules that then ostensibly have to be represented by some amount of code. How do you folks at USDS tend to approach addressing those complexities and that kind of translation layer that has to happen?
The best way we could do it is by listening. So I remember being in a conversation, not understanding why FastForward was super complicated. And then we actually talked to the engineers on the ground. There's a ton of business rules and tons of business logic that actually goes into FastForward and how they make determinations. So the best way we've learned is just by just listening to the people who have 20 years of experience on the ground, right? And then saying, okay, how can we make this application simpler while still understanding those business rules? And sometimes some of those rules are policies, and we can actually talk to the lawyers at the agency and say, hey, this policy was done 3 decades ago. Does it still make sense to be using this today? And that way we could try to reduce some of these business rules as well.
That's an interesting comment you made there at the end. Have you observed agencies making policy changes in a reaction to a project with you folks?
Yep. So one of the things that we have is a DITAP program where we help train up some of the procurement folks there in a way that allows them to do agile contracts a little bit better. And that DITAP program changed federal policy.
Oh, well, that's pretty cool.
But I do find that, yeah. So like for instance, there was a policy where at a particular agency, they needed an alert box to pop up that lets you know that you're on a government website at all times. And we actually talked to everybody and got them down to, like, you don't need this big JavaScript alert. They wanted a JavaScript alert to pop up every time someone was trying to log into a system that you're logging into a government system. And we said, like, okay, show us that policy and why we're in. And then we found the policy, and it just says like it has to be there somewhere. So just put that, near the login screen, and not this JavaScript pop up that would have been bad for a user experience for everybody.
At times, the rules and requirements we mentioned before could shift and change, as you might imagine. Are there aspects of your approach to engineering that help alleviate those impacts?
So like in the private industry, we have the agile development for the software development cycle that government's just not on the curve yet. So we try to implement that so that way we can make these changes as they happen, and we don't have to wait for waterfall requirements where they would spend the 2 years up front, and I was talking about before. But then by the time it's 2 years, Congress may have changed the laws, right? So now your project's already, behind just on the law itself. So we try and go in and we say, okay, let's just do these agile. Maybe we'll try 4-week sprints because they're used to like 6 month releases. So we'll try, all right, let's try 4-week sprints. Then we can slowly work it down to 3 weeks and 2-week sprints. And that way agile requirements come down and we talk to users, and those requirements may change as we talk to the users. We can just shift really quickly in the next sprint.
And you mentioned using some things from like the agile approach or framework to acting. I believe you mentioned, like, for example, like sprint length. Are there other aspects of that framework of doing things that you found that are easier to get organizations to take on themselves, or things that are harder?
I definitely found just getting people to release things a little bit difficult, right? Because they're used to just releasing a whole thing and not just an MVP, right? Every feature has to be in there day one. But what we found is as we can show them that we can release slowly and iterate and keep iterating on it, we have been successful in that, right? That we could show them that it's an MVP. We're going to release it out to users. Let users use MVP. We're going to just take a small piece of this program, release it out to the public, and then from there, see how the users interact and then make iterative changes based upon that.
In your experience there, I noticed that you mentioned like you kind of have to show them that it works. Are there things that organizations like tend to look for to see as like, I don't know, proof, for lack of a better term, that the approach is more effective?
So one of it is, Health and Human Services, that's Center for Medicaid and Medicare, they have this mainframe for Medicare payment processing. It's a 60-year-old system, and written in COBOL, and they've been trying to modernize it for decades at this point. And one of the things that we came in is we said, all right, we're not going to try and modernize the entire thing all at once, right? There's a 60-year-old code, and it's been there for a while. Like there's tons of logic and business rules and things like that. How about we just take a small piece of it, right, and move that to the cloud, and let's see how that works. And we were successful doing that, taking that small piece of it, moving it to the cloud, and now that helps build trust at Health and Human Services that, okay, like maybe we actually can modernize this if we just do it kind of slowly and piece by piece and move it all to the cloud eventually. So that's one approach that we found that works, is just kind of just taking a small piece of something and then just moving it to the cloud can have like tremendous, impact on an agency to help them see that that it is possible to move this, 6-year-old mainframe COBOL program to the cloud.
Okay. I think what I'm hearing from you there is that, are you saying that like once you've shown them that you can deliver like a real world thing, that confidence seems to grow?
Yeah. And other things that we do is we build prototypes, right? So we show them like, hey, you said this thing could take 2 years, but we pretty much did 80% of it over the weekend, right? And here's a prototype for it. And that's been really, really successful in showing that it is possible to move the needle forward.
It's also interesting that you mentioned like prototyping as a phase possibly that you might engage with there. What would you say that like a prototyping phase is like for a project over there at USDS?
Yeah. So first we start out by talking to all the users and figuring out, okay, what part of the system are you having problems with? Then it depends on if it's a fresh, brand new project or it's a current project, but I'll take it like it's a fresh, brand new one that we're launching. We'll talk to users and kind of get like, when they come to, let's say, www.example.gov, what are you trying to get out of it, right? Like, what is your end goal here? And then we'll start. Sometimes it's just on paper, right? Sometimes a prototype will just put a paper, just like a thing drawn up, and ask them like, hey, okay, what would you do here? What would you do here? What would you do here? And then maybe we'll make a digital version of that and then put that in front of users and just see how they interact with that. And that's usually how we start, and we just keep going back for user feedback as we continuously, improve the system that we are currently working on.
So now that we've talked a little bit about kind of your relationship with partners and the idea of like translating business rules into code and kind of the things around those topics, I'd like to have us switch over to our third topic for this conversation, which is focused on mentoring and developing engineers. Because as you might imagine, one aspect of building an engineering team is figuring out how to empower members of that team to grow and develop. You as an engineering leader, and quite a senior one, how do you prefer to go about that sort of thing?
Yep. So part of how we empower them is, so most engineers come at a just GS15 level, which is the highest you can go in the government pay scale outside of like the SES role. And that helps us have a seat at the table. But one of the things that we do is we're allowed to have a seat at those deputy secretary meetings, right? So I don't have to be at those deputy secretary meetings like another engineer can. And, like, trust. So once they come on board here, like we explicitly trust them, right? That like I'm not gonna sit there and say you should do it my way. Like we explicitly trust everybody to go out and solve these tough technical problems.
And I would imagine in the environment y'all work in that there's probably a considerable amount of diversity and technologies used and tools needed for different projects. And I imagine that it's probably nigh impossible to make sure you have every single thing covered by staff. Meaning that like probably folks have to learn new things as they go on to different tours of duty. Are there processes or things that folks there try to do in order to like get up to speed for those sorts of things?
Yeah, so for that Medicare project I was talking about earlier, with the putting in things in the cloud, we had an engineer who learned COBOL just so they can do that, and he bought a book on Amazon. Just so they can learn COBOL. So yeah, one of the things that we look for is people's ability to just adapt to the situation and learn on the ground. So for example, I love Python, but we may go to an agency and they're Ruby on Rails shop, and I have to be comfortable enough that, okay, like I'm willing to do Ruby on Rails, because I don't want to change all the engineers from using Ruby on Rails to Python, right? Because I prefer it, right? And that's a huge knowledge gap, and then we have to do a ton of training, and then we have to rewrite the entire site. But like, I can just come in and help out and just jump in and on some Ruby on Rails code. So one of the things we definitely look at is for people's ability to kind of jump around and be willing to learn and adapt to the situation at hand.
And do folks in the engineering practice there at USDS engage in mentoring at all? And if so, what does that look like for you folks?
Yep. So we have a weekly engineering COP meeting where we're able to talk to one another and figure out, like, for example, we have site reliability engineers, and some engineers aren't like as up to date in site reliability engineering. So they can talk to that engineer and just learn and mentor them. One of the things, as I mentioned before, the tour of duty model is, so, I'm in my fourth year now, so I have to eventually roll off in April of next year, but I plan to like step down as director in sometime in January, February. So what I'm going to do is talk to the community, send an email in August saying like, hey, if you would like to be director of engineering, you can come shadow me for a little bit, sit in some meetings, and like really sit down with me over the next couple of months. So that way, as like, I prepare to handle this role, I can have a bunch of engineers who can learn from me. And that way I don't have to, then we make the process fair, right? And that way I can show them like, okay, before you just jump in and apply, this is actually what the job is.
That's really cool. I did not realize that there were folks that got to shadow someone at your level there in the agency. Yep. That's really neat.
Yeah. And I have tons of one-on-ones with people just so I can kind of ensure that like they're happy, or just any questions I can ask for them. And sometimes, they'll ask me like, hey, I'm having a certain problem at this particular agency. Since you've been on so many different agencies, what would be something like you would recommend, or like, who can I speak to more about this? And I'm, always willing to help people in that regard too as well.
Since we're on the topic of mentoring, I thought perhaps we could give some set of our listeners the opportunity to get a tiny amount of free mentorship from you. To that end, if you could give any advice to an engineer, either like just starting out or kind of early on in their career, they're like looking at what to do, what would that advice be?
Part of the advice I would definitely say is, don't give up. A lot of things can seem confused, like really confusing, but eventually one day it's all just going to click, right? Another thing, especially that helped me, especially when, as I was, becoming more of a web developer, was just going to hackathons and meeting the community and seeing what they're doing. Go to meetups, go to your local meetups, just keep meeting people, network, and just keep learning. Don't stop. And like, again, it may seem very complicated at first, but it'll all make sense and click one day.
Since you mentioned meetups there at the end, this may be geographically limited to who this is helpful for, but are there any meetups that you've observed that are like particularly good to go to?
Yeah, so Code for America has tons of meetups all around the country. So, they have a brigade that people can go to their meetups, and it's all around the country. And that's one I definitely recommend. They're doing really, really great work.
And I believe at the kind of in your introduction, I think is where I'm remembering that you said this. You mentioned that you yourself are kind of part of that committee of folks that help like figure out who is like a good fit to hop on and join USDS. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yep.
So in your work with that, what kind of traits do you look for a person that, like, let's say there's like a listener out there that's like heard this conversation and they're like, yeah, like I want to do this. Like, what kind of traits would you think that they would be best for them to like cultivate to be a best fit?
One of the things we look for is mid to senior level folks, but we are always hiring like exceptional engineers. So, we had a Hack the Pentagon, and we had and from that Hack the Pentagon, we hired an 18-year-old just for the summer to come in because they was able to do so exceptional. But for us, one of the things that we look for is just being flexible, independent, confident, but not cocky, and a team player overall. And, someone that's willing to help fight through the bureaucracy. And desire to serve is one of the huge things that we look for.
You mentioned the idea of kind of like being a team player. What does that mean in the context of USDS? Like, how would you describe that?
Just being able to work with all different types of skill sets and people, and I think you mentioned earlier before that some people could be difficult to work with, and just making sure that that they're not coming on board to yell at people, right? Just being we're all here together, and everybody in the federal government is trying to do the same goal, is by giving by helping use design technology to give people the services that we have promised them in Congress, right? So we're all here to do that.
Now, let's say that some intrepid member of the audience has heard all of this and they've decided, that's me. I'm that future USDSer. How would you suggest they go about registering that interest?
So they could definitely go to usds.gov/apply, and we're always hiring because we have that total duty model. So we're constantly hiring, and we're looking for engineers, designers, procurement people, product managers. We have a position here that we like to internally call bureaucracy hackers. People who worked in government for 10, 15 years and going to help us, people who came from private industry, navigate the bureaucracy. We're always looking for talent recruiters. But yep, I would tell them, this work is really, really impactful. And I moved down here with my family 3 years ago from New York City, and it was a big move. It was very scary. I won't lie. But if I had to do it all over again, I would do it again 100 times over, because the work that you are able to do here is just really amazing.
I really appreciate your willingness to show some vulnerability there. I don't know that I've heard much better as far as like pitches for a role go. I really appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah. So like this I never did civic tech before this, and like I think now this job has ruined me, right? Like I feel like I have to do civic tech after this. I can't go back to doing like Uber for dog walkers or something. I have to do. It has to be civic tech, and being able to make that impact. Nothing, like I said before, bureaucracy is hard, but just when at the end of that light in the tunnel, that you are really making a difference in someone's life. And anywhere you go in the federal agency, you are potentially helping millions and millions of people. And I don't think there's no greater feeling than that.
David, again, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to come and share your thoughts and expertise with us here on Civic Tech Chat. As is tradition on these episodes, we like to give the guests the opportunity to set us up with whatever concluding thoughts they'd like to leave us with as we depart the episode. So for you, David, what would those thoughts be?
So back in 2016, I built a site and I showcased it out to the USDS, and it uses the civil rights data collection set. And what that basically is every 2 years, the Department of Education will go out and ask schools for information about students and just the school in general. So, and that information is broken down by total enrolled students, by gender, and race. And one of the cool things that they have about it is that breaks it down further, right? So you could tell by race or ethnicity who was suspended and how many times, and then they break it down by how many students are in gifted programs. So moving down here in DC, my son was around 2 or 3 years old at the time. So we knew we was gonna have to put him in school. So we knew we was gonna have to move if we stayed down here and figure out the perfect school for him. And I was at the Department of Education at the time, and they asked us for our help on like how should they release this civil rights collection data set. And before they was doing it by CDs, and we was just like, well, first, not by CDs anymore. And maybe you could put it just on a CSV, and that way people can download it and they could throw it into Python or R if they want. So I ended up using this data set to find a good school for my son. And what we was looking for when I talked to my wife, we was looking for schools that was diverse. We wanted our son to go to a diverse school. And we was looking for schools that, while being diverse, didn't equally allowed every ethnicity and race of students to be into the gifted programs, and a school that didn't have like a disproportion of like one particular group of students getting suspended. So we found that perfect school using this data, and it was pretty cool because I ended up being able to showcase this to the Deputy Secretary of Education at the time, James Cole, and I really got to sit down and share with him like, this is why opening data is important, because people like me and this was just something I built internally. It was built on Node.js and Postgres, and from that, what ended up happening was, so my son went to school. He just graduated kindergarten a couple of weeks ago. And before he graduated, they gave him a letter, and he's been put into the advanced reading program, which is like really exciting because, as we know, if you get put in these programs early on, it enables you to be more successful in the future. So I was really excited, and this data really helped pick that perfect school for my son. And all I wanted was just for him to go to a school where he had an equal, as a Black and brown student, where he had equal opportunity to the same opportunities everybody else has in the school. And so over the weekend, I went to see how that changed, because I knew this the CRDC data comes out every 2 years. So I went to see how that data changed compared to before. Like, is the school same as like when we first originally picked it? And looked at the data, compared to, they are the same. But then I was just like, well, I use this for my wife and I, right, to find the perfect school. But I'm sure everybody else would love to just look at this and at a point. So I ended up releasing it, and it's on schooldiversityreport.com. And not anybody can try and find that good, diverse school for their children, and hopefully for them it works out the same way it worked out for my son. And I do think that data set did help. So I really think, as I'm monologuing here in my closing thoughts, like, especially for, the government listeners, government folks of your listeners, like, open sourcing data is like really important. And like, people like me, I didn't even know about this data. So even promoting the data is important. But I didn't know about this data, and it really helped me pick the good school for my son. I guess a monologue could have been a little bit better, but
I think that was rather good. It's wow, like the way you managed to use your skills and like the idea that this day was open to empower your son, and then also to help empower others is remarkable. I know there's going to be folks out there that are going to be inspired by that story.
Yep, and for folks who just want to go, you can go to School Diversity Report, and you can search it by zip code or your school name. It's easier by zip code to find the school. And now we can just pull up a report of it. But my inspiration for building it was, just making sure that my son had a fair, equal opportunity as everybody else, and in whatever school we put him in.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing that story with us, and also letting folks know where they too can take a look at that tool and perhaps help their kids out as well.
It's all open source too, so you can find it on my GitHub at github.com/David E. Holmes /CRDC. I originally built this in 2016 over a 20% project here at USDS over a couple of days. So it's not the best code, but it certainly works. But if anybody wants to improve it, they're more than welcome to submit pull requests.
Excellent, and I'll make sure to include links to both the site and the repo that you just mentioned for folks that want to explore and maybe start submitting those PRs for you.
Yeah, awesome.
I do want to thank you again for taking the time to be on the program. I have no doubt that the listeners out there are going to enjoy getting to hear your insights, lessons learned, and just getting to learn from your experience.
Yep, and thank you for having me.
You can follow us on Twitter using the handle @CivicTechChat, visit us on the web at civictech.chat, or subscribe to us for content updates wherever it is you download your podcasts.